a cattle drive. Well, I did one little one, but my dad, back in those days, they didn't have trucks and trailers to haul cattle, so you had to drive them someplace to get them on a truck or to get them on the train. So, if most of you might remember, over here at Metcalf, out east of Bonnyhands, there was a set of corrals and everything called Metcalf. Well, that's where they had to drive the cattle to. But from our ranch to that was 2 days, and they drove them across there. And back in those days, you know, if a man was riding across country somewhere, my dad was commissioner for a while, and he'd come to Kermit. Well, most of you probably knew Tommy Thompson and his wife Louise Thompson. Well, Louise was a Baird. There's a watering on our place that's on the west side called Baird. You remember Baird over there in those sand hills?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they sold that to my grandfather and everything when they wanted to leave the country because they got tired of that sand, so they moved to town. Well, on these cattle drives, you've probably seen pictures of roundups, of cattle drives, you know. John Wayne was real good about roundups and stuff. And if you saw the movie Cowboy, that's probably the most original, authentic movie about cowboying. And that's how the name cowboy came into effect. Back in those days, the men up in the panhandle were taking care of crops. So who was going to help drive the cattle north to the railroad line? 12 and 13-year-olds. And so that's how the word cowboy came in effect. Now, I'm all for rodeos. And a lot of the guys in rodeos, the ropers and stuff, are usually come from a ranch or someplace. But there's some in there that I call rodeo athletes. But being a cowboy, to really be a true cowboy, you have to move cattle. A lot of people want to be called a cowboy and one thing or another, but they're really not because they didn't help move cattle. Now, on those cattle drives, they didn't have sleeping bags that you rolled up and put on the back of your horse. They had big sleeping bags with about a 3-inch foam or a cotton mattress. They slept good because they had to, because they worked late and got up early, so they had to have a good night's sleep. They slept under a tarp, not a tent. They had these big tarps that they'd roll these sleeping bags, these bedrolls up in, and that's the reason why you see them, they're about this big around when they're rolled up and strapped. They carried them in the back of a wagon. Wherever the wagon stopped to make a meal or supper and whatever, that's where they spent the night. And they'd unroll those bedrolls, sleep, get up the next morning, roll them back up, throw them on the wagon, cook, take them to where they're going to have dinner and whatever. Well, the one I got to go on, Cowboys told me, you better put those boots under your canvas here, under that tarp. Oh, okay, well I forgot to put them underneath there. And I said, well, why do I need to put them under there? Keep cows, T10 in them. And I said, really? They said, yeah. And I thought, no, that won't happen. So I didn't put mine underneath there. The next morning I got up and put my boots on. My socks got wet. I thought, oh, I didn't see any cows come in. And then I got to thinking, I bet they poured water in my boots. So I asked, no, we didn't pour water in your boots. Well, some years later, my dad told me they did. Oh, and when you didn't have corrals when you're on a cattle drive, you used rope. You'd take your catch ropes, tie them together, and there were times when you'd just have to take a bush or something and tie a rope across there, because most of the horses back in that day and time were what we call ground broke. You could step off of a horse, drop your bridle reins, and that horse would not move. You could shoot a shotgun off, and that horse would not move. They would stay right there. That's the way they were trained. And so they were ground broke. And a lot of remooters was just left like that. But then a lot of times they'd make a rope corral, and that'd keep horses in too, because horses weren't afraid to go ahead and hit that rope or whatever. And then, like I was saying a while ago, my dad was commissioner, and he'd ride across the Kermit from our ranch house. It was straight across the road. It was about 12 miles. By the highway, it's 15. And he'd a lot of times stop at the beard place and eat supper, and then go on to his commissioner's meeting or whatever was going on in Kermit. The highway, or the road from Odessa, one of the highways, Cleachy Road, or a lot of it just a dirt road until it got to the hard ground, then it was rock. It was 40-something miles from Odessa to our ranch house. It's 47.9 now. Well, there was no road other than to our ranch house. That was the end of the road. To get to Kermit from Odessa or vice versa, you had to go through Monahans and around that way to get into Odessa. When my mother was teaching, when she met my dad at the Texhoma Hotel, that's where she was staying, and he'd come in a lot of times and eat supper there. He was 14 years older than she was. And she said the minute she saw him, she knew that was going to be the man she married. And she did. And when they got married, he told her, he said, now I can't afford a honeymoon, but I'll take you later. 56 years later, he took her to Europe. That was her honeymoon. When they got to the house that night after their wedding, they were getting ready for bed. He said, oh, by the way, I've got 15 cowboys coming in the morning to help me move some cattle. She said she didn't even know how to boil water. So he taught her how to fry a steak, how to make biscuits, how to make gravy, how to cook free-holded beans. And my mother was a great, great cook. She cooked a lot of meals around us and stuff. You have to be a good ranch wife. You have to know how to cook good meals for your cowboys. Right, Vicki?
Yes. I don't cook them.
Oh, you don't cook?
That's my mother's job.
Karen does. Karen does.
That,
What? Oh. I don't know where he started all these stories that he's reminding me about.
he's got better memory.
Yeah. When I was 6 years old, I got to go on my first roundup. And we were living in Kermit. We moved, my dad moved our family from the ranch out here into Kermit when I was 5 years old. That was in 42. During the war, because they couldn't get tires for school buses, so he moved us into town so my sister and I could go to school. My mother taught my sister from first to second grade out at the ranch. But anyhow, so I was going to get to go on my first roundup. So we get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, drive out to the range, chuck wagon sitting there, and the cook's cooking. It was a cold morning, man. I mean, it was cold and dark. And I'm standing there by the fire, getting warm, and I could see all these eyes out there looking at me in the dark. You know, you ever have that feeling where you think everything's watching you in the dark? Well, about that time, I had to go. And I was sitting there jiggling and wiggling and dancing and thinking, boy, I've got to go. And so I thought, well, I'm out here at this fire. This fire's nice and warm. I think I'll just go right here. So I started to get pants unzipped and everything, and the cook saw me. He walked over there and he had a big old 12-inch cast iron skillet. He walked me on the rear end and said, you talk about being a jar. He said, don't you pee on my fire. I tell you what, I didn't. I didn't have to pee the rest of the day either.
Bill, how far could a horse and rider